And being sure of that, I'm saying that because since in internet there are many private interests also that are mixed there, can be confused in some cases that, and those are private interests, and private interest and public interest is not synonyms. Although in some cases it can go together. I mean, for instance, public-private partnerships, and because internet many cases are provided by private companies. But we have to realize that maybe will be the private interest. The private interests also have other interests, which is their profits and their benefits and so on. And maybe for them is in their interest not to connect everyone because, okay, or not to provide the same opportunities to all, because in some cases, okay, if we already provide mobile connectivity somewhere, what about providing other alternatives like Wi-Fi or like fiber optics if they already have mobile and it is very profitable? So we don't have to invest and we are taking the money anyway. And what about connecting the people who don't have incomes? They will have no interest as a private interest to connect someone who doesn't who can afford, the connectivity. So that's why yes or yes, we have to look as from the private, for the public interest perspective, to look to the minorities and not to look to just whoever is connected, but also the others and the minorities.
Thank you very much, Ramon, and thank you very much for highlighting this, the point of minorities and more diverse and slash marginalized communities, which should be a main focus for this discussion. I'm going to hand the floor to Mevish right now. Mevish has been doing a lot of work on access, ITU, and also digital rights communities. So Mevish, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Bruna, and thank you for having me. To answer your first question, perhaps the most fundamental way to think about, the public interest in the context of the internet is to think about whether the consideration of the users, both individuals and communities, are at the center of not just the deployment of internet technologies, but also the design and the development of them. Civil society has taken different approaches to this concept. At Article 19, my team and I use the human rights framework to build human rights considerations before the point of deployment in the design and development of internet infrastructure technologies. I think some of the points that Ramon makes are really important. Bruna, you asked whether the internet is working on behalf of any public interest concept. In answering that, I'd like to respond to a slightly different question. Does the design of the internet reflect the public interest? And to answer that, I think you really need to look at the political economy in which the internet is developed. The development is largely driven by industry at this point, with the support of home governments under the assumptions of, of a capitalist environment, right? And we're not just talking about the US and Europe, we're also talking about more market interventionist states like, say, China, South Korea, and Japan. And some of the very deeply embedded private interests, these industry-driven assumptions, present some of the staunchest challenges to the design of a public interest internet, right? So let's take the example of publicly deployed internet connected infrastructure like smart cities. Often these technologies are marketed in terms that sound like the public interest, but are actually techno-solutionist, like social good or public safety. Within civil society, we're often talking about these kinds of technologies from a point of skepticism, because they're often enabling the surveillance and datafication of people while claiming to be able to fix problems that are actually the consequence of inequities in our social infrastructure that pre-exist the technologies that we deploy. It's not a coincidence that you find the tech sector descending on structural societal problems like policing or housing or poverty or education. The simple fact is that marketing something as a fix sells, but it undermines the structural work that would actually reflect the public interest. So this is not to say, like Ramon said, there are definitely moments where public and the public interest and the private interest intersect and even align. But civil society needs to be there in the decision-making process to be able to question some of those industry-driven assumptions. So if we want the internet to be governed in the public interest, one of the key ways to do this is to build civil society's intervention in the design and development of internet technologies before we even get to the point of deployment. This can be really difficult because much of this is completed entirely behind closed doors, but standardization presents a critical opportunity to do that, right? Standards bodies like the Internet Engineering Task Force, the International Standards Organization, the International Telecommunication Union, as Runa mentioned, the ITU, the Institute for Electrical and Electronics Engineers, these are spaces where civil society can and should engage. And while these spaces are often driven by industry and governments that want to enable their technologies, we can enter these spaces as civil society to take our public interest approaches to question some of those deeply embedded narratives, right? Narratives of techno-solutionism, of efficiency as the primary value for driving education, or the need for technology in all aspects of our lives.
Thank you very much, Mavish. And I think, and just as kind of sort of bridging this conversation, you touched upon points such as the consideration of users being at the very center of the design and deployment of technologies, and also a lot of need for us to consider the political economy in the scenario that is set out behind the development of such technologies. And now I'm going to hand the floor to someone from the private sector. So Graham, I'm gonna hand you the floor to bring your perspectives as well on what has been kind of the principles or definition of public interest that have been shaping your work, or either the tech sector work with regards to domain names and so on. So you have the floor.
Sure. Thank you, Bruna. And so, hi, everyone. I'm Graham. I'm from one of these evil commercial interests seeking to exploit all of you. Really what that means is I work for a large domain name registrar called 2Cows. We've been involved in internet infrastructure since 1993, for forever, I think. And generally, I think we're a good actor in this space. So I think this is an interesting question. And I actually, unlike me, scribbled down some thoughts. So apologies if I seem a little reedy. Normally, I would wing this on the fly. But I think the problem we've got in the framing of this question is that we're treating the internet as a monolithic thing. And that's where I think we sort of go off the rails when trying to define a public interest, because there's so much complexity inherent in this system. And any solution or any really thinking on a public interest needs to reflect that complexity. And my experience in speaking with regulators and governments and basically anybody who's not an expert is we tend to lose sight of that complexity, and that's a real problem. And so I think that given that there's just an immense competing plurality of ideas of what the purpose of the internet should be, that getting to a public interest is going to be extremely difficult. And so where I think we have opportunities is to bring it down, or to think about it in terms of the layers of the functions of the internet itself, and figure out what we want that public interest to be. So I work for an infrastructure company. I think a lot about the infrastructure of the internet, not necessarily say the content layers that sit on top of that. That's a whole separate world of thorny, difficult problems. So I think the public interest there in that infrastructure layer is that it's robust and resilient, it's secure, it's flexible, it's accessible, it's maximally enabling for people around the world. And so I think there's opportunities to say, like, that's what we want out of the infrastructure layer of the internet. That's our public interest. How do we protect that? So for me, a lot lately, that's been thinking about what I would call DNS abuse or technical abuse of the internet. That's people in my world using domain registrations to exploit the domain name system or exploit the internet to cause harm. And I think there's, ways into that discussion where, we can make some definitions of what is harmful, what's against the public interest, and figure out the incentives, disincentives, and regulatory approaches to really tackling those things. You know, I had some interesting experiences, and I've shared them, I think, in other sessions about trying to look at harm, you know, websites and domain registrations against the public interest related to COVID. And it was a hilarious disaster. It was like next to impossible. You know, my team spent hours and hours. We looked at something close to 20,000 different websites related to COVID to try and assess these things for harm. And there was so much diversity in there, and there was so much subtlety and nuance in trying to assess that I think we're nowhere near the place for those conversations. And so maybe if I can try and wrap all of this up. You know, public interest and approaches to it need to reflect the complexity of the system. I think there's real opportunities at the infrastructure layer and what we want it to do. And we just need to make sure that we're reflecting that our approach, the complexity of the problem in the complexity of our approaches. And that's maybe, I think, where there's a bridge between what I'm saying and what Mawish, and I apologize if I just brutalized that, was saying, that's where we can get some standards and working with, you know, the IETF and others to really come together and build approaches that we can all agree on to make the internet a better place for more people. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Wayne. And also some points you highlighted in your intervention, such as agreeing on values such as openness, accessibility, and robustness, are like starting points for this conversation, either at the technical community or part of any of the layers related to the internet. So this can be definitely a starting point for us to try to convene a common understanding, or even try to achieve some sort of agreement in between stakeholders. I'm going to hand the floor now to Farzani. Farzani, you have 4 minutes.
All right, great. Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. My name is Farzan Badi. I work at Yale Law School. I'm not representing my employer here. So for the sake of saying the obvious, public interest is difficult to define. Global public interest is even more difficult to define. And then even more difficult when we talk about the internet and global public interest. Now, public interest is a concept that domestically has been abused by states and other actors to reach their political or other agendas. Some argue that in the developed world, since they are democratic, you see less of this abuse because there are checks and balances. But unfortunately, on the internet, some of those checks and balances might not work. For example, if you look at the international organizations and governments at Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, you see that they argue many things are in their remit because they are in the public interest, despite providing no rationale as to why those issues are in a government's realm. Governments claim that they are in public interest and get away with it. And we have not been able to challenge these claims. And we see more and more policy changes in the name of public interest, which we don't even know what it is. Sometimes on the internet, one country's public interest is another country's public abuse. I give you an example. When it comes to sanctions, since many of the registries are based in the US, many of them comply or even over comply with the US sanctions. Now, the US argues that these sanction laws are to protect the US public interest. But the sanction laws are not in the public interest of the normal, non-governmental, non-blocklisted residents of sanctioned countries, because it has a sweeping effect on their access to the internet, something that we discussed that the infrastructure layer wants to provide, and also various functions of the internet. For example, you have the .ngo that is being allocated by public interest registry. This registry is set up to, and I quote, serve the public interest online, arguing that their globally diverse team is committed to providing a stable online platform to enable people to do good things, but not all people. Of course, they don't really mean serving global public interest, because they simply can't claim that, because in the US, there are sanction laws that the residents of sanctioned countries they cannot register .ngo. There are ways to overcome these problems without always talking about setting some grand international organization or involving one, convening some high-level panel to talk in abstract, or always putting the governments in charge of that unknown global internet public interest. To actually discuss the interest applicable to a globally distributed network, we need to look at the public interest as a globally distributed concept. This means that we need to look at various functions of the internet, how and who conducts them, and if and what sort of public interest issues that may rise. And the public interest on the internet can not only be decided by the governments, and I'm going to save the magic word since I am sure you have heard it a lot at the IGF, but if we only have a group of governments that tell us what global public interest is on the internet, with no checks and balances, when we are going to have expansive and broad definition of public interest that frankly wouldn't serve the public interest and would serve the bureaucrats' interest. We have seen the concept of public interest being used and piggybacked on for policies that can potentially harm people and the very public interest they claim to defend. One is bringing safety and security to the internet. I can make examples of when private actors, along with the government, argue that they are fighting against bad actors to bring safety and security to the internet. But at the same time, they obviously want to protect their private interest through those policies. So if you ask the global public interest to raise its hand in this room, we are going to see a lot of like functions and elements of the public interest, and they are not only in this room. They are distributed all over the internet, and as Graham said, we need to look at it on the different layers. And sometimes what we consider as public interest, it might not become public interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Farzani, for your intervention and also highlighting some points from you as well. On the relevance of being wary of the various applications of what like a global public interest could be, and how this can feed into governments taking more authoritarian decisions in light of what they deem as a public interest. But thank you very much for the intervention. I'm going to hand the floor now to Peter Misek from Access Now. Peter, you also have 4 minutes.
Thanks, everyone. So yeah, I wanted to join this mainly, to kind of reflect on this big campaign that Access Now and many of you and other partners in the space contributed to, which was to push back against the proposed sale of control over the public interest registry to private equity firms last year, and end of 2019 and the first half of 2020. I think we've heard a lot about the complexity and the difficulty in defining public interest, which makes it kind of ironic that in this case it was quite clearly the public interest registry that we were trying to save, and truly Access Now did see this, and many of our partners saw this in very stark terms. This is the home of civil society online, this domain of .org. As we learned throughout the course of the campaign and heard from many of those proposing this deal, right? It's not just NGOs, it's not just do-gooders or something that are registered on .org. But nonetheless, we've established this space and we've built it into an incredibly valuable and rich environment and ecosystem and home for civil society online. And I think that was reflected in the valuation of the proposed deal to sell control of the public interest registry at around $1.1 billion. So a few things, that stuck out to us through this campaign that lasted about 7 months. It actually kicked off at IGF in Paris in November 2019. First, .org is one of the few platforms that is available to civil society that we've built up, and that again isn't controlled by either a private company, profit-seeking company, or government. The Internet Society has controlled the public interest registry since it was since it created it in 2003, when it was granted control over the .org domain. And this is really important to us to have, this formal stamp of civil society control. Say what you want about any individual organization, but just the fact that you have a entity that's organized legally as a nonprofit and was granted control of this domain under certain terms, right, to protect the public interest. It was important to us. It was also clearly important to the almost 900 organizations and more than 27,000 individuals who signed on to a letter to save.org, and that should be still available on save.org.org. The second thing is that, we see, I think, as other speakers have said, not just increasing kind of capitalization and privatization of the shared internet resources. That's been true, I think, since the beginning of the web. But this hyper capitalism and this the extension of walled gardens to almost everything we say and do online is something that creates a lot of vulnerability and creates kind of a monoculture. I think, as we've heard in some other panels, that's really dangerous. One thing that having our own domain can do is to allow us to create our weird and wacky websites and put some diversity and permaculture forward. And then finally, I think we all agree again that there's more that could be done to protect this domain, and that is coming out on this panel is that just calling yourself the public interest registry doesn't mean everything you do is in the public interest. So it's we came up with some of our partner organizations with a few safeguards that we think are necessary to sort of prevent this sort of, pulling the rug out from under us again, this proposed sale to unknown entities with a lot of money, but also to protect the public interest. And those three are to adopt robust protections for freedom of expression and privacy. So putting human rights at the center of the operation of this infrastructure, committing to affordable pricing for the domains now and in the future. I'm just locking that in because again, $1.1 billion valuation for .org really raised questions as to how that money would be recuperated. And then finally, strengthening governing structures around .org. So it is putting a diverse and representative panel of experts onto the board, and ensuring real power for the community, opens questions as to how we define, right, who's the community, who gets to sit on the board, and who's actually going to be sustainably inputting. But we think those structures are necessary to create. So that was a successful campaign, and I think reflected, if nothing else, that there is still an active and very large community globally that wants to help protect the public's interest online.
Thank you very much, Peter, for the intervention and also for highlighting that there's still a lot to do in safeguarding digital rights and participation and diversity in these spaces. So we thank you very much for the intervention. Right now we have a space for anyone who is either on the attendee or the panelist list who would wish to like raise their hands or bring any new perspectives to this discussion. So if you would like to speak, please raise your hand either on the chat or on the Zoom room, and I will be happy to give you the floor. And in the meantime, if any of our panelists wants to reply or add any thoughts or ideas to what has been discussed so far, you're also welcome to do so. Since I am seeing no hands, or Ramon, do you Would you wish
Okay.
to speak?
Yeah, and after the thanks for all panelists for the points of views and trying to get into. Let's try. We are at GIFINet. We are promoting community networks, so people doing that by themselves. So now from that perspective, I mean, I'm talking about the infrastructure, and sometimes it has been said that the internet is so complex, many variety and a lot of complexity on it, and so on. But at the end of the day, it's about thinking and applying the common sense and looking holistically and making the things simple. And I want to try to provide two very simple and hopefully understandable concepts that can be easily addressed, right? One is okay for bringing internet, we need infrastructure that has to be built, right? And typically, what's happening is that all the big fundings that are, you know, are being used for that are reaching just large companies, but not the local communities to build the networks from themselves. That's the reality. And look, what happens if it goes only in that way? The thing is that, okay, we are connecting the people, we are providing internet through a large company, but at the end of the day, the behavior of that company is just taking the money of the internet that we have provided to them, which is actually becomes a need because people need connectivity, and we are extracting the money for that. So what about the economics that at the end of the day are happening? We created an extractive tool for making maybe the poor people even more poor than they were before, because we created a net and they have to spend the thing. So we have, it's as simple as to say, okay, what about not just bring the money to large companies, but also to the communities to empower themselves to get connected? Because yes, maybe technology is complex, but it's not that complex to, for instance, I'm in a rural area and connected with fiber. And at the end of the day, it's about buying a cable, installing a router, and something that can be done by the citizens and not just only the large companies. So it's important to create alternatives to that. And secondly, a very stupid thing that is also happening against the common sense, against the public interest, and quite often I see that happening through the public administrations. They are managing the public domains and so on. There are many infrastructures around there, like power lines, railways, where the internet is already there with the fibers deployed on those public infrastructures. When people are trying to access to those infrastructures to get connected from their homes, and for getting access to those infrastructures, quite often they give you a price, a cost for accessing it, and they index the cost to the meters, to the distance for accessing public conduits, aerial post, or whatever infrastructure needed for deploying interest. That's stupid, because that yes is mathematics. That's against common sense. Whoever is have longer distance and fewer populations, if you are living in a rural area, will be much more expensive. So we'll make common sense to abolish definitively the indexing, the pricing for accessing those infrastructures to get access to the internet by simply avoiding, and no regulators or very few regulators are looking into that. So just a couple of examples, how the money, the public money, is being given for providing access to the internet, and how the taxes are being happening. And somebody should look to what in if really we are taking care about the public interest.
Thank you very much, Ramon. Yes, you had your hand up. Would you wish to speak? Or if not, I can paste your questions on the general chat as well. I have promoted you to a panelist. And in the meantime, I can also read Deirdre's comment on the chat, which was that we globally need to be aware of that our core values, our perspectives and perceptions may not be the same, and it shall be important to add to the complexity of the discussions we're promoting today. I'm going to post also Ahet's questions on the general chat, so everybody's aware of that. If anyone else wishes to take the floor, if not, we can move on with.
Bruno, maybe the panel can answer Henriette's questions.
Do any of our panelists want to address these questions? Okay. So I think that's definitely food for thought and things we should
Sorry,
consider in the
Bruna, I
panel. Go
didn't get
ahead.
it. It was Andrea's question about the core infrastructure.
Yeah, whether or not we think if there is such a thing as a public core to the internet.
So I totally agree that we need to come up with a definition of these well, I hate this word definition because it makes everything complicated and a lot of we can never reach consensus really. But we need to really identify the core public infrastructure, which is internet infrastructure, which is global, so that these public infrastructure do not have to abide by like one like jurisdiction or one body of law applies to them, because we see this problem not only in the domain name area, but also we see it in the internet regional registries, that we see that there are like the country-specific law can also affect like people around the world. Like for example, Europe has sanctions against certain countries, and then the internet registries, and then they can bring lawsuits against these internet registries to not to provide the IP addresses to people in those countries. So I think that we need to definitely have a framework on how we define them, and hopefully give them immunity. I mean, I know this is and this is a really loaded word, but I don't know if the framework or the norms that these commissions or high-level panels they come up with, they are practical or issue specific. And until now, I have not seen an effect. But I think that we really need to look at the issues that brings up the public, that actually violates public interest globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Forrest. Another question that has been raised on the chat is that recently Eli Parise proposed that to mend a broken internet, we should create online parks. And this was in comparison to the development of commonly owned public spaces, such as parks in cities during the early industrial age to private enclosure of the internet today. So, and also already bridging to the second part of our conversation, where we're going to discuss the challenges both your works across this community faces in upholding global public interest as a principle or any related principles. I would also like to ask this to our panelists, if at first any kind of idea surrounding more common open spaces are taken into consideration, and also which challenges are you currently facing, and examples of measures, proposals, and anything else that can help us protect the internet as a common and whatever our almost agreed concept of public interest. So I think I'm going to start with Ramon again, and we can follow the same order.
Myself, and when.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'm glad to see create common spaces and so on. That's the way to go. If you want to go to public interest, participation is a key point. And any way to participate in all the layers. I was referring previously to the infrastructure, and citizens, yes, can help. The communities can help in building their own infrastructure and not depend only on the others. That's a good alternative, and that could happen also in all other layers. I've seen referrals to the DNS, to the core of the internet, and many other layers. And the way to go, yes or yes, is to democratize everything, to be sure that everything becomes participative good practices are being applied in all the layers, and yeah, the way to go. Create common spaces and being sure that people gets involved in absolutely all the layers, and being sure that not a few layers are just in hands of a very few hands. In short, that's the point. The policies have to be approached from my point of view.
Thank you very much, Ramon. Moving on to Mavish. Mavish, if you could add anything on the challenges we have been facing recently, and also examples of measures and proposals to protect the public interest.
Thank you, Bruna. I think one of the major challenges that civil society faces, at least when we're talking about internet infrastructure decision making, is just the power asymmetry that exists in the most critical decision making spaces, including spaces that are multi-stakeholder, right? So when we look at the landscape of bodies that develop technical policies and standards that make up internet infrastructure, we see plenty of them that claim to be technically open to civil society, but we as a sector face several structural barriers that hamper our effective engagement in these spaces, right? One is financial. Participating in standards development, while critical for public interest advocates in general, is heavily resource intensive, right? Standards develop over the course of years, and they require in-person participation in several meetings per year, in addition to intersessional work on mailing lists and spaces like GitHub. And really that means that civil society just needs funding to support not just travel and meeting participation, but staff time in between meetings as well. And so that's also consideration that funders need to be aware of when they're providing support to civil society. But the other major barrier that we see is the knowledge barrier. These are extremely technical spaces that have their own very particular histories, very particular politics. And so being effective in them means not only knowing the technologies, but also knowing the idiosyncrasies and communities that make up the space. And this can be very difficult for new entrants to hit the ground running, which is even more stressful when you think about the resource scarcity problem that we have. And that's not just for, human rights organizations like mine. It's also for small community-oriented infrastructure providers, ISPs, community networks like GriefyNet and GriefyNet. So in terms of responding to these challenges, I think that the first step is really continuing to build civil society networks in and around these standards bodies. There are a few civil society organizations that do work in these spaces, and they can provide support to new entrants in overcoming the knowledge barrier and connecting them to funders to help them with the financial barrier. But we really need to do a much better job of bringing global South representatives into these spaces. Right now, even the civil society advocacy that is present in these spaces, although small, is dominated by global North perspectives, and we really risk perpetuating that same monoculture even within our own sector as we bring that up. And that's something that we need to address in terms of the power differentials that exist in how easy it is for global North organizations to get funding versus global South organizations, how we can champion our partners and allies. Speaking as somebody who works for a global North organization, I think that's really important. The other way is working more on the funding side, right? Governments, particularly those that have publicly aligned themselves with internet freedom agendas and the idea of a public interest internet, present a critical opportunity for us here. These governments are often civil society funders through their ministries of foreign affairs and their departments of state. They can create funding opportunities that provide civil society, that can support civil society interventions in these spaces. But these governments can also provide pathways to support the participation of civil society in intergovernmental standard spaces, which remain the least multi-stakeholder and the most closed off to civil society participation. These are standard spaces like the ITU and the ISO. And governments can provide that pathway by allowing civil society to join government delegations to these standards meetings, for example.
Thank you very much, Mavish. Graeme, so for civil society, as both Mavish highlighted and also Ramon highlighted some parts of it, power imbalances in those spaces, and also allowing for more participation and for other stakeholders to understand the layers and intricacies of the actors and forums as well is an issue and also a challenge too for us. But moving from stakeholder to another stakeholder, what would be the challenges you would see or like to point out in this, and also examples of measures and proposals?
Thanks, Bruna. The resourcing issue is interesting. I spent 4 years as the elected chair of the registrar stakeholder group inside of ICANN, which represents all ICANN accredited domain registrars, and was really exposed to the diversity of that group, and was part of my mandate was to encourage diversity in that group, get more voices from more places to participate in the policy development process. And boy, was that a really interesting challenge. Huge language issues there, and there's a sense that a lot of the commercial players in the internet are these sort of giant megacorps, and there are, of course, lots of those. My company, I think, is sort of medium-sized now. We've grown a lot over the past few years, but we're not huge. We're the second largest domain registrar in the world, and it really wasn't until the past year, 18 months, before we really dedicated someone to policy issues full time. And it's really only in the last 2 years that any company other than GoDaddy within the registrar space had a full-time policy person. The vast majority of domain registrars trying to engage in this space, it was just a small portion of one person's time. These are small shops with like 2 or 3 people, and trying to engage even for them, even as commercial entities, in standards building, in policy development at ICANN is extremely expensive, time consuming, and they don't have resources for it either. So it really is a problem that it's narrowed not just to commercial entities, but a small number of commercial entities, and we need to solve that problem too. I don't have any great ideas on how to solve this huge array of problems in front of us in protecting a global public interest. I think whether we like it or not, the internet is built on commerce. It's commercial entities all the way, essentially top to bottom. My experience with governments is that they tend to be bad actors in a lot of circumstances, even the good ones. Even I'm Canadian and our government is by and large good, but we still have lots of garbage legislation floating around that causes me deep concerns. And so I don't have great ways to provide spaces that are not impacted by these commercial interests. I don't want to ramble about this for forever, so maybe I can break down what I was saying earlier in my earlier intervention about separating the internet into layers, figuring out public interest for a particular layer, and then working on that. And so I'm spending a lot of my time on DNS abuse right now, thinking a lot about incentivization programs so that we can reduce that sort of technical harm on the internet and incentivize, it's going to be registries and registrars to take action on domains that are causing people harm. And so I think there's interesting solutions that can be done that are tailored and narrow to solve specific problems. And that may be a reasonable way forward, rather than trying to go boy, this is the grand scope of all the problems with the commercial internet and a global public interest. Is let's pick a layer, let's look at the low-hanging fruit, and let's start working our way upwards. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Graham. And interesting points as well, as especially on the idea of us all compromising on behalf of the same kind of goal towards public interest, and having the internet as open, as robust as we know, and for it to remain as it is. Moving on, I'm gonna hand the floor now to Farzani as well for the same question. So challenges and opportunities and proposals. Farzani, you have the floor.
Thank you. I think I said a lot of challenges, so I'm not in my most optimistic mood. So, but I totally agree with Graham that we need to really look at the public interest on the internet at a granular level, because if we look at it in this, then if we don't, then we are just gonna miss a lot of things, and we are going to miss a lot of issues that are real public interest issues, and we are going to be left with norms. And I think norms are very important, but norms that cannot be enforced are not effective. So what we need to do is to move away from giving the states or the governments the mandate to come up with this, with the definition or what global interest is, or what they think, or who can identify the global public interest. I think that the stakeholders should be able to do that. But as I said, there are difficulties with that, because sometimes like stakeholders, they have conflicts among each other. What is a public interest, and what is not a public interest, and it can be, as I said, it can be abused. But I think ultimately we need to look at the various functions of the internet, how the internet comes together, and consider its distributed nature, and look at, then we will not miss part of the public interest that could be violated in some part of the internet. And also when we discuss about, like, stakeholder participation, civil society participation, it's not only about participation, because we see that we come up with a lot of policies that we think in a multi-stakeholder fashion, and then there is a advisory committee there that can just say, well, no, I need you to change these things. So it's not only about participation, it's also about empowering them. And multi-stakeholder approach is not the answer, not all the time the answer. And we can discuss this in like having like 2-3 stakeholders, or I don't know. But I don't think that we can have just the government to come up with the public interest for the global internet.
Thank you very much, Farzi, and also for highlighting that it's not only about civil society participation, but also about a meaningful and qualified one. So last but not least, I'm going to hand the floor back to Peter. Peter, again, same questions. If you have any comments on that, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Yeah, super thoughtful stuff. I think one thing we tried to do in the .org campaign was to get people to conceive of this domain as a digital civic space, as online civic space. And I see this talk in the chat about the idea of creating online parks or something, or dedicated public interest spaces. And I think there's issues with that. I know in the U.S., at a public park, you could say just about anything you want, so long as it follows certain time, place, and manner guidelines. I think it would be interesting to see that play out online. But yeah, again, this campaign showed that there is a huge and broad active communities that are willing to fight for what they see as a public interest. And this concept of the public core is, I think, really useful, because again, if we get rough consensus around what one piece of the public core might be, and then we can, I think, create broad coalitions to protect that. And so, I think the two main campaigns that Access Now runs against internet shutdowns and intentional disruptions, and then on digital ID and access restrictions, both get at aspects of what it means to be a human and enjoy your human rights, and do so online as offline. I think the more that we can kind of identify these key threshold issues, like just the ability to access affordably and openly and securely one piece of the internet that gets you end-to-end access to another end of the internet is something that, you know, we might be able to coalesce around, and then work through all of our different layers to protect in some way, you know, as we can. Yeah, and I think for us, you know, it is about protecting space for the most vulnerable and human rights defenders, and that often comes back to security and protection from reprisal for what you say and do online, which I think it has become more difficult as we're more distributed and kind of isolated and locked down in this pandemic. Yeah, that's where we are. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Peter. And well, moving towards the very end of our session, I'm going to hand the floor to Shital for a quick summary of our discussions. But at the same time, I'm going to ask all of our panelists to write their voluntary commitments if they came up with any for this session. So this is something that the IGF has implemented this year, and we're asking every single panelist of the workshops to add their own voluntary commitments to strengthening the IGF or digital cooperation discussions. But if you can all type this on the chat while Shital does our high-level summary of the session, I'll be thankful for that. Shital, you have the floor.
Thanks so much, Bruna. I'm going to try and do this in 2 minutes. It's difficult. My computer also crashed halfway through, so I'm so sorry if I miss anything. But I think what we've heard is that the term public interest is very complex. It's very difficult to define. There's so many different aspects to it because there are so many different aspects as well, so many different angles and layers of the internet to consider. But we were reminded that part of considering the public interest is not just speaking to the majority, but also minorities, who are also what could be considered at the heart of the public interest, which is users and the communities, including vulnerable communities. So we heard the term has been and continues to be abused to reach particular agendas, by particular groups, but that, in line with that, there are specific private interests that can sometimes dominate in the space, which is why it's so important for spaces where discussions are had around the internet, its functions, to be open to broader stakeholder groupings, because otherwise we can end up with solutions that are techno-solutionists that don't consider a broader range of issues that need to be tackled by all stakeholders. And we also heard about the various layers, design, deployment, and all the layers at which standards are developed that need to consider the public interest and where a very wide range of interests need to be represented. And some examples of how this can be done and what it means to do that. We heard that it might be a good idea to approach it layer by layer, in a more granular way, and that public interest at the infrastructure layer, for example, could be considered to contain, concepts such as robustness, flexibility, security, accessibility, and really the enabling power of the internet needs to be considered. The distributed nature of the internet needs to be safeguarded, and that's part of the public interest, I also heard, and that there are a range of ways to think about what it means to protect the public interest at the infrastructure layer. One example was the campaign around public interest registry, where the campaign has called for robust protections, human rights to be, built into that governance of that registry, affordable pricing, strengthening governing structures so that they're diverse and representative. And then we also heard an interesting discussion about the public core and how important a concept it is. Key threshold issues perhaps need to be defined in order to make it an actuality. And then we can work through all the different layers to try and integrate those sort of thresholds into the governance. So a lot there. Hopefully that captured some of the richness of the discussion. As I said, I did miss out on some of it, but thank you so much. Certainly learned a lot, and yes, look forward to taking this discussion more broadly to other spaces as well.
Also taking the opportunity to thank you all for this session and for the discussions and contributions. This was just a way of starting this conversation, or a way of bringing this conversation to the Internet Governance Caucus. And this is also a space where all of you can engage and be part of. So thanks again for the session. And I guess we're done for today. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Bruna.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks, Bruna. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all for the discussions and interventions very much.
Thank you. Bye.